Hello, fifth grade. We are here to start a new chapter in our social studies. We are not going in chronological order. So we just finished chapter 6 on the early colonies. So how England began to start the colonies on the eastern coast of the United States. So we have Jamestown, Plymouth, and blinking out. I was going to say Roanoke, but that's not right. So what we are going to actually do is, instead of focusing on how the rest of the colonies started and how we got to like 13 of the main English colonies, we're going to skip to chapter 8, and I want to talk about slavery because it's really important that the chapter kind of comes after the colonies, but you can't have the 13 colonies without understanding that slavery was happening like 9 years after Jamestown. So it's really important to know that the formation of the 13 colonies was partially and predominantly, especially in the South, brought on by the fact that the British started their own slave trade companies and took from what the Spanish, the Dutch, and the Portuguese had been doing for 200 years before that. So we have to kind of remember what we learned from exploration from chapter 5, and remember your explorer reports. And some of your explorers traveled along the coast of Africa and around the western tip of Africa trying to get to India, right? Those explorers began to set up land claims along the western part of Africa. And the Portuguese and the Spaniards and some of the Dutch really were the start of how slaves and slavery and the practice of inhumanizing people and making them be the labor force started, because then we had the colonies in the Caribbeans and in South America before we had the English colonies. So between like the 1400s and the 1500s, when the Portuguese and all these Spaniards were exploring land, they were also starting to realize that in Africa was a developed country just as Europe was. And that usually doesn't get seen. They usually see them as like, oh, they were like Native Americans living in huts, which isn't really true. They were wealthy. Africa had gold and ivory and copper and like all these amazing resources that when the Europeans came down, they're like, whoa, this stuff is like better than what we could get in the Orient. And then they realized, like, oh, well, we can barter and trade. We could give them weapons. They'll give us gold. And then they realized that they had servants. People had servants, but they realized the way they were treating servants. And sometimes they, in like African groups, they would enslave people as like punishment or to repay debts. And then people would eventually work their way out of freedom. And eventually they started to barter or trade with people. And then they started to realize, like, oh, well, we have these people, these slaves, and we're going to bring them to our new colonies and our plantations in South America and in the Caribbean, and we're going to start using them. And then the British come along and they realize, like, oh, we're late in the game. We gotta get to it. We gotta make our money too. And which we're going to see some few little videos on. The king pretty much just says, okay, let's build a slave company. And British, instead of having like the Virginia Company of London coming to start colonies, they created a company to literally just go to Africa, take slaves, which are being kidnapped by African groups and kingdoms and empires, and were traded on the coast and brought across to the United States or the Americas. So we're going to cover all of that. And the reason it's kind of going to cover into life of the slaves during the colonies, and then we'll go back to the colonies and the 13 colonies. But I want you to have that in your head, that the 13 colonies could not have existed and start and be expanded without labor. And that labor came from the slave trade. Okay. And, I know all of us aren't dumb. So we know part of this current event idea of, we see these protests, we see Black Lives Matter, we see people fighting for injustice. We're saying people have been treated poorly for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And it dates back and it begins to when slavery started in America and the inhumane treatment of Africans, eventually African Americans when the colonies happened, because they weren't kidnapping Africans anymore. They were just people from Africa who had generations had children, and they started to breed slaves. Right? They didn't treat them like people; they treated them like cattle and livestock. So they breeded slaves. So they eventually had African Americans, and then you have this group of Black people that grow and become generations and generations, more generations probably further than the British people in the New England colonies, and through the Southern colonies continuing with slavery when the North stops, and then you have the Civil War, and then you have the slaves getting their freedom, and then, oh, you're not free, by the way, you can still work our farms and we'll give you a little bit of land, and I need you to do all my labor for me. So it just continues for hundreds and hundreds of years, and then you get to modern our time, right? And people are still being treated poorly. So history doesn't necessarily stop. History does repeat itself in some form. So, and it's always a power struggle, but we're going to start from the beginning, and hopefully I explain it well. Okay, so in Google Classroom, wherever your teachers post the reading, I'm going to read through the reading. You need your Chapter 8 packet. We will go through it. If you flip through the packet, you're going to see there's some pictures that obviously do not copy well on the photocopy machine. So we're actually going to do a lot of interpretation and have some discussions via you listening to me, and you may be thinking critically on your own at home of what do you see in the pictures. So right now, this is the beginning picture of the chapter. It's like the second page of the chapter, right? And it is in the colonies. It is a slave trade. The slaves were disembarked from a ship. They were brought to port and they were sold. Now, when you grow up and you start taking, classes in college and you start looking at art, you interpret art and you see what is the artist trying to show, right? You see color, you see vibrance, and then you see darkness, right? And what do those things symbolize? So, your wonderful teacher who loves humanities and art, I even look in the background and you can see someone being examined. I know those who have animals, but you examine an animal. I mean, these people are being treated like animals. And then what I always find interesting about this is how the artist depicted the slaves being before they're sold and how they drew them, which is very interesting because if you look at art and how they depict pictures of ethnic groups, now we see children's book, everyone is diverse, everyone has their beautiful features. But in art, hundreds of years ago, ethnic groups were depicted very poorly and very racially to kind of show their prejudices they had. So if you look at these gentlemen, you can see their fine features. You can see, all these features about them. They look very like person. Like I can see that person. It's like looking at an ID card. You look at these people, and the way they depicted the slaves is like not even human, right? They took out the human qualities of a person, even in the art. Yes, I could tell this is a young lady, but if there was another lady in the picture who probably had more detailed features drawn, I know that woman probably, or girl, she's probably a girl, was much more featured, or probably had better features than how she was depicted. So these are things we need to pay attention in the art and in these drawings. Obviously, there was no cameras at the time, but the art is also interpreting kind of like the opinion, right? You see one kind of like running around. They would have them do exercises to kind of see, are they strong enough? They're being examined. You see all of these sitting down here being examined. You kind of see a scowl look, right? They're kind of showing like, they're evil, they're not kind. You see a lot of sullen faces. But again, you see like this like overly large forehead. Like people don't look like that, right? People don't have like this like 3-hand bump over their head. So what they're trying to do is depict them as not people, right? So it's kind of part of this issue of how slavery started, is they took away the humane quality of people and took that away to make them feel like, not to make it feel, but to make it seem that it was okay to do what they did. All right, I'm going to stop talking. We're going to read. Have your packet out. Remember, you are going to do the vocabulary as we come up with those words, and we're going to go through the art. So I'm going to begin reading Life in West Africa in the 1500s, which was right around before like the Portuguese and the Dutch and the Spaniards built their, or not built, the British built forts, but they had like these forts on the coast of Africa where they would have, because they couldn't really know the land of Africa. It's so vast, largest continent. And they couldn't figure out how to, manage through to get to the inner parts of the kingdoms where there were more people. So they required different tribes and different groups to kidnap slaves and bring them to the coast and then they would load them up. So the slave traders never really went further inland besides the villages or empires and groups that lived on the coast of Africa. So we're going to read about what Africa was going on and how this all started. The pictures, I will show you the much larger colored pictures. So I'm going to begin reading, and then we'll share some images. Life in West Africa in the 1500s. West Africa is near the equator and is south of the Sahara, a large desert in northern Africa. To its west and south is the Atlantic Ocean. Most of West Africa is covered by grassland or rainforest. In the 1500s, the people of West Africa were alike in many ways. Most people farmed crops that helped them feed the people in both small towns and large cities. Other people were miners, craftsmen, or traders. Traders led caravans of camels across the Sahara to trade gold and ivory for salt and cloth. Throughout West Africa, society was based on family. Relatives lived in the same village, and they often owned land together and shared their crops. They had many different religions, customs, and traditions. Some people who lived in small communities honored the spirits of their ancestors. Some villages would dance and sing chants to ask the spirits for their protection. Other people were Muslims who learned their religion from traders from the Middle East. Another one of their common traditions was storytelling. Fables, legends, and myth helped these people learn about their culture and history. These stories also often had a lesson to teach people how to act. So if you don't see a connection here, I see a large connection to the indigenous populations of our Americas, right? The Native Americans, and just culture in general, right? They had a culture, they had a way of life. But West Africa were different in many other ways. Some lived in small villages, others lived in cities, such as Timbuktu. Timbuktu, it's actually a real place. Some villages and cities were part of empires. The people of West Africa spoke many languages. The people from different villages often could not understand one another. Most West Africans lived in freedom, but some were slaves, and the number of enslaved people would grow quickly when the slave trade between West Africa and the American continents began. So it's just an example of a village. Personally, it kind of reminds me, if we think of your Native American groups that you guys studied, right? There's jobs being done, there's some livestock, people are living in homes. And here's West Africa, here's the Sahara. So we're talking about this region right here. And if you were a European explorer, you could kind of remember if you were one of the explorers that traveled around this coast and founded these points. All right, so we're going to I'm going to jump to all right, I'm actually going to read the next section, and then we'll go in our book and in our packet and go back because the picture is at the end. All right, Europe and the slave trade. Slavery existed in West Africa for many centuries. These enslaved people were servants or workers. Some of them had been captured during wars and had been found guilty of crimes. People from West Africa were also traded across the Sahara Desert. Each year, several thousand Africans were traded to countries in the Middle East for salt and other goods. Although these slaves were not free, many of the slaves in West Africa remained part of the larger family in a village. They may have had fewer rights than other villagers, but they could own land to farm. They could even become skilled workers and earn money. Their descendants could become free. Traders from Europe changed this way of life in West Africa. After founding colonies in the Americas, many Europeans had sugar and tobacco plantations that needed workers. Using slaves was a cheap way to get the work done. Traders from Europe went to West Africa and offered cloth, rum, salt, and other goods in exchange for slaves. Many Africans became wealthy by trading slaves for goods like these. In addition to these goods, the European traders also offered to trade guns for slaves. A village that had guns became more powerful than its neighbors. As one village grew in power, its neighboring village were often forced to sell slaves to Europeans in exchange for weapons to protect themselves. Soon, groups all over West Africa were capturing and enslaving people to trade for guns. And so here's our picture. So I'm going to see if I can move this. All right, so you can see this picture pretty large right here. All right, so if we turn the page in your packet, page 2, we'll go back into the vocab. Let's just look at this picture, and let's look at the questions in your packet, all right? So our packet asks, list at least 5 specific details. All right, so what do you see? 5 things that you see. So I'm going to show you this picture. Pause it for a second. 5 things that you see. Now, what do I see? I see some people being held here. Can't really see that much. See if we can zoom in a little bit more. Some of these pictures, I try to find a better version of it, but can't always. So I see there's some forms here. Someone like has his hand raised. There's almost looks like 1, 2, 3, like 3 persons here. They don't look as they were clothed. These all look clothed. There looks to be holding weapons. There looks to be groups and shadows over here for other people. Maybe this is a village, a ship. And then compared to the others, this one has a knife, he has a gun, smoking a pipe, has maybe like a water bag, maybe his bullets, his hat, okay? So maybe it looks like he's the person trying to gathering the slaves. There's the ship. Looks like that's a horse, right? So it's probably someone had a horse to help raid a village. Maybe these work with him, right? So find your images. And what is the person to the right holding in his hand? Give evidence to support. So what does he have, right? He has a gun. He's smoking his pipe. We probably know he got his gun from a European. What do you think the people to the left are doing? All right, so I want you to come up with your ideas. Do you think all of these are captured? Do you think maybe these people are holding, almost like maybe they did capture a few Africans from this tribe maybe, and they're holding them to bring them onto the ship. This one has his hand raised. Can't really tell what that is, but maybe almost look like maybe he's getting hit or hurt. So I want you to come up with your own ideas. I'm not going to fill anything out on here because this is pretty much your viewpoint of what you see, right? So you can look at the image, and as I said, prefer to look at the other one. And what's the person on? So I could do a few things here. We have a ship near the coast. See a village in the distance. Almost looks like small children. I can't really tell, but looks like there's the person on the right. Has a gun, knife, probably tobacco. What do you think the people on the left are doing? All right, so I want you to come up with your own hypothesis of what's happening. All right, so let's carry on. So from the reading, circle West Africa on the graphic organizer. So where is West Africa? So if we go back to our reading, I'm going to zoom out a little bit, just a little too close. West Africa. So West Africa is along the coast of Africa, the west coast of Africa. So we're going to kind of have this section right here is where we are of West Africa. Describe slavery in West Africa in the 1500s. So the question first is describe slavery in West Africa in the 1500s. So we can say before Europeans, West Africans were enslaved as servants or workers. Oh, we can't highlight. It's right here. Enslaved people were servants and workers. And another part, it says they were enslaved in villages as servants and workers for being captured during war or for crimes as punishment. And then another piece here is they were also traded in the Middle East for salt and other goods. So we have West Africans were enslaved in villages as servants and workers for being captured from war or punishment for crimes. Slaves were traded in Middle East for salt and goods. They had fewer rights, but eventually could be free. Their children were free. They could earn a trade. And then it says, why did European traders come to West Africa? What did they do? So we're going to go back to our readings. And then it says here what happened when Europeans came. All right, so traders from Europe changed this way of life. So the Europeans, why did they come? So they were traders from Europe went to West Africa and offered cloth, rum, and salt and other goods in exchange for slaves. And they also, it says, what did they do? They traded and offered guns. And the villages in Africa began kidnapping and trading more slaves in order to gain more weapons to protect themselves. All right, so European traders came to West Africa and traded cloth, rum, salt, and more importantly, guns in exchange for slaves. By trading guns for slaves, African villages and empires began weaponizing themselves for power. I don't think we're going 3 and 4. All right, so I'm going to pause it here. Make sure you write that down. All right, so before we wrap up our lesson, I just want to show you this quick little video that kind of summarizes everything that we just read.
European influence in West Africa began when Portuguese ships began sailing down the western coast, searching for a passage to the spices and riches of the Orient. As more countries began sending ships into African waters, stations and forts were built along the West African coast. Because the West African coast was the nearest part of the continent to the European holdings in Middle and South America, it became the center for the slave trade to the Americas. But the slave trade was not a new enterprise. For centuries, the Arabs had been paying African middlemen from the Sudan, as well as the East African coast, for slaves to be exported to North Africa and Asia. But the European entry into the slave trade had drastic economic consequences for West Africa. African middlemen became rich and powerful, as did the coastal states from which they operated. But the savanna states of the interior grew weak and unstable as their people lived under the constant threat of raids, capture, and enslavement.